Okay, so I just realized I did this whole tutorial and did not have the sound recording, so it was all silent. It was a beautiful tutorial, best tutorial you've ever seen, that you'll never see because there's no sound. So I'm going to go ahead and do this again, and third time's a charm. So we've talked about creating metals, and this builds on that. And honestly, with all the detail we went into in the other tutorials, this should be pretty quick. So the first thing is we're going to want to select an object to apply this to. And we're going to be doing this on this wine glass. Now, with transparent materials, it's crucial that they are the right scale. If you have a wine glass that is, say, 200 centimeters tall with 3 or 4 centimeter thick walls, then when the light hits the glass and bends or refracts as it goes through it, and then bends again when it comes out the other side. That's why glass and other objects magnify things. It's going to magnify the light far too much. It's going to bend it far too much, and our brains are going to know something is wrong. And so you need to make sure you're modeling your objects to scale. This wine glass is modeled to scale. It's based on a wine glass that I used to have. My wife just broke the last one we had just the other day. And so this wine glass is to scale. A couple more things about this scene. There are 2 types of lights, or 3 types of lights that are in this scene. And actually, let me delete those. Okay, so there's 2 types of lights that are in the scene that you have. First, there's what's called an infinite light. And then there's this softbox. And the softbox is basically just a area light that I called a softbox. If I render this with the area light turned on, you'll see that the shadows are really soft, and they aren't very focused. And the light is basically directly above them. Now I have fall off turned on this as well, which means that if I hover over these little arrows and if I pull this up, right, the intensity of the light is going to drop, and that outer boundary is sort of when it's the least intense, right? And so, if I want something to be properly illuminated, I need it to be either here or maybe just a little bit past. Oops. And then when I render that in the correct view, right, I get something that's pretty well lit. And you'll see, right, this is coming straight down from above. I could put this anywhere I wanted to and have the same thing. Now, one of the issues is, right, why are these shadows so soft and how do we get hard shadows? So soft shadows happen when an object is when a light source is close to an object. If a light source is far away from an object, you get harder and harder shadows. So we can demonstrate this by creating a point source light. So I'm just going to add a light to the scene. I'm going to uncheck my softbox, so that's off. And then I just want to move this light in my right view. So it's sort of, up a little bit above the floor and aiming towards those things right in the middle. I'm going to render that. Oops, sorry. I'm going to render this. And when I do that, I don't get any shadows because I haven't turned shadows on. You will notice that there are some shadows on here, and that's because I have a render setting called ambient occlusion turned on, which we'll talk about in a second. So let me go ahead and make sure I turn my shadows on, and I'm going to make them area shadows. And I'm going to render this. Right? And so you can see the shadows coming off over here in either direction, but they're very, very soft. You'll also notice that this is rendering in a way you might not be familiar with, and we'll talk about that in a second as well once we get done talking about lights. So, however, if I move this light further back, like let's say, and currently it's about negative 130 in the Z, so if I make this, say, negative, let's just say 300, and let's make this 120. Oops, and I totally messed that up. So let's do 120 and negative 300, and then hit enter or click the apply button, and then render this. All right, my shadows, you'll see those angles are steeper, and so they're less soft. Now, if I make this significantly larger, let's say we go negative 5,000, and we go, and we'll just say 500 for this other value, which is going to change the angle some, but it doesn't really matter. And now if I render this, suddenly my shadows are much harder, right? Because this is, several meters, like 50, the light source is 50 meters away. It's still a little hazy on the edges, but it's pretty far. So if I go back even further, let's say I go back, or I go up 1,000 and back 10,000 units and hit apply, and then render this, my shadows are going to be even more crisp. And so you can do this. You can use a point source light in order to get these nice hard shadows, or somewhere in between. But that's why shadows are hard or soft, is how far away your light source is. And in this case, the light source is so far away from the scene that you have to use your X, Y, and Z positions here in order to control it, because you can't, like, everything's going to be totally minuscule and you're just going to keep dragging for infinity if you try and do it manually. However, there is another, if you just want hard shadows, there is another tool that allows you to do that, and that is called the infinite light. And it's this light with this arrow icon up here. If I undo light 1 and I turn on my infinite light, which should already be in your scene, and I've just rotated it, it starts out going perfectly horizontal along the Z-axis, and then you just need to rotate it down a bit to get it to cast shadows, and you have to turn the shadows on. But once you've done that and you render it, you'll see that you get these nice crisp shadows. There's a little bit of haze around there, but they're very, very sharp. And that's because this light is essentially set, like, I can't remember how many units away from the objects it is, but it's set really far back. But, right, the control is still within your window, because it doesn't matter where you put it. It could be pointed this way towards your objects. It could be on the other side. It doesn't really matter where it is. What's important is this angle in terms of how the light is falling across the scene. And so that's what an infinite light is. It gives you those nice, hard, crisp shadows. And so we're going to go ahead, and you could either leave light 1 on or your light. I'm going to leave light 1 on for now. I'm going to render this one more time. And I might raise the light up just a hair, although this is actually perfect. It frames everything nicely and you'll be able to see the shadows like we need. Okay, so the other things you may have noticed are some of these render settings. And so I want to show you what I have turned on so you can do it yourself. So if you click on render settings, you want to make sure you're using the physical render up here in this dropdown. And then under the physical render tab, I currently have it set to progressive. What this does is it basically gives you a really low quality, full frame render of your image, and then it does a series of passes to clean that up, right? Right now, well, I actually stopped it, but I'm sure I probably did 50, 60, or 100 passes and then got these really clean images. The other thing that's allowing these like nice shadows on the front edge of these cups and some other more contrast to come in here is this effect called ambient occlusion. The way that you, if I turn that off and render it again, you'll immediately see the impact, right? There's nowhere near as much shadow here. And basically ambient occlusion creates like a little bit more darkness between objects, which is the way the real world looks. There's always a little seam, like if you look at things on your desk, that sometimes when you're rendering it, it doesn't make physical sense because, we're not accounting for all the imperfections in these surfaces that cause this shadowing. And our eyes probably cause some of that to happen too, because it's probably good for us for evolution. And so if you just turn ambient occlusion on, if you ever want to add it to your scene, you just go to Effect here. And if you haven't already selected it down here, you select it and then it will pop up in this menu and you can turn it on and off. Okay, so those are the render settings. And the reason we're doing this is because transparency takes a long time to render nicely. And so instead of waiting for these blocks of the screen to be done, this progressive render just allows us to see our changes almost immediately across the whole thing. And I like it better than the interactive render for doing transparent materials. Okay, so now I need to create some transparent materials. So I'm just going to go ahead and double click to create a new material. And if I double click again to open it, right, I can call this glass, and I'm just going to call it glass 1 because I've already got a glass material down there. And so what we're going to do is we only need a few channels on this to make this happen. So first, we don't need color. We're going to turn the color channel off entirely. As soon as we turn transparency on, it overrides anything that's happening in the color channel. Second, we are going to turn diffusion on. We're going to uncheck effect specular. But for whatever reason, glass just looks a little bit better if you set this to somewhere like 19 or 20%. I don't know why. I have no understanding of what it is that makes that look nice, but it does. It seems to make some sort of subtle difference. And then the other two channels we're going to be focused on are transparency and reflectance. So I'm going to turn transparency on. And then I'm going to go to reflectance because I want to show you what happens. As soon as I turn transparency on, I get this transparency layer that pops up in my reflectance channel that allows me to control some of the settings for that transparency. I'm going to turn off the default specular. In fact, I would go ahead and just remove it. We do not need it. And so I've just got my transparency, and you can see it's got roughness, reflection strength, specular strength, and bump strength. Some of the same settings, but a lot fewer down here because it's tied to some of the settings we're going to set in transparency. So I'm going to leave this alone for now, and I'm going to go back to transparency. And in transparency, by default, the refraction preset, right? And refraction is how much light bends as it moves from one medium to another. So from air to glass, or glass to water, or water to air, whatever that is, it bends a little bit, right? And that bending is what causes magnification. And so with our refraction preset, it should automatically be set to glass. If it's not, just pop this drop-down menu down and choose glass. You can notice there's a bunch of presets in here. And if you ever have any other material that you're wondering what the refraction index of refraction is, you just search for index of refraction chart or index of refraction and that particular material that you want to know what that number is. Right? If you were trying to make something with, say, like recreate a that glass that's a Pyrex, right? If you were trying to recreate Pyrex, you could search for index of refraction Pyrex, and you can find that online, and then you would just go ahead and type that value in here where it says refraction, right? Because all this does, if I change this to diamond, right, is it changes this value, and you'll notice it also changes how much it magnifies the objects behind whatever object you're doing. So if I do glass, it's a little bit less. I'm going to leave all these other things alone. But then the last thing that I'm going to need to do, we'll do in just a second, but I want to apply this material first. So let's go ahead and apply this to one of our glasses. And I'm going to specifically, I want to do this glass because there's actually a line object in here that we're going to do later. But right, specifically this glass. So I'm going to go ahead and render this now. And I want you to see that I actually have, even without having made any reflectance changes, I have pretty believable glass, right? It looks pretty good. It seems to be bending light in the right ways, and it's dark in here and things are working well. But you'll notice that it has absolutely no shadow, right? And so how do we get a shadow on a transparent object? The way we do that is through this texture channel in our transparency. And specifically, we want to go down to Fresnel. And so I'm going to go to Fresnel, and then I'm going to click on the word Fresnel. And I'm going to come down here, I'm going to check mark this physical option, right? Because this is physically accurate. The other version here, you can basically use a gradient to do the same thing, whereas this uses an index of refraction value in order to set that gradient. And so I'm going to go ahead and choose glass. And what I want is crown, not heavy flint, because that is the 1.517. And then you'll notice that this is pitch black. And that's because by default, this index of refraction is set for opaque objects. And so if I click invert, then what happens is it becomes more transparent on the front and less transparent on the edges, whereas otherwise it's more transparent on the edges and less transparent in front. And so if I check mark that and now I render this, then the shadow is physically accurate, right? It looks like a shadow of glass, right? There's areas where it's thicker, and so the shadow is darker. There's areas where it's thinner, and so that shadow is much thinner. And you can see if the light's shooting straight through these two surfaces versus through the side, it's a lighter shadow and it's a darker shadow, right? And so that gives me a shadow on this glass object. And then if I go to my reflectance channel, Right now, my specular strength is 0. If I want there to be specular highlights from a light in my scene, so say I'm using a point source light like I'm currently using, right? The infinite light is a point source light, as is this other default light here. What I'm going to need to do to get those highlights to show up on my glass is I need to increase my specular strength. I'm going to start by blasting it out to 100, right? So we can actually, right? So now I can see those specular highlights from the lights that are illuminating my scene. In this case, it's just one light. And so I'm starting to get some of those specular highlights. Now, if I increase the roughness a little bit to say 15%, right, then that makes that specular highlight larger and more apparent. Something that can work even better is to use that softbox or an area light, because the area lights can be visible in the reflection, right? So I could potentially turn my specular strength to 0. And then if I uncheck this light and I check mark my softbox, which again, this is illuminating from above, and I render this, right? Even though I have my highlights off, you can see that the light is being both reflected there and reflected on these parts. Now, those specular highlights are pretty low. They're pretty quiet. And so what I need to do is select my softbox. And if I go to details, this is where I both turn on my fall off, which I have set, and I also turn on the show and specular, show and reflection, and the visibility multiplier. I have it set to 400%. If I boost that up to 800% and render that scene again, you'll see that those highlights get a little bit brighter in this scene, right? And so this is something that allows me to keep my light not being just totally blasting out the entire scene, while also giving me a little bit more brightness on those highlights. Now, if I wanted to, I could also come back in here and turn, take my specular strength pretty high. And when I do that now, I should have even brighter specular highlights on the rim of this glass, right? And there's a little highlight there and here, right? And so it becomes to look more and more physically accurate as it goes. And this is super dark down here. I don't know exactly what's happening there, but we're not going to worry about it too much. It's probably because I only have one light in the scene and it's coming from above. If I go ahead and turn on my other light as well, it's going to be a lot of light. And the whole thing is pretty washed out at this point. But you can see that I do get the highlights on both faces of this glass. But again, it's really blasted out. So I might want to reduce the intensity of one of my lights or pull the fall off back a little bit, or even reduce the intensity of the specular strength. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my to just using the light.1. I'm going to turn the softbox off so it's a little bit more chill. I do have my specular strength set to 100. I could reduce that a touch and still have a pretty good effect. I could increase my roughness a bit more, but if I go too rough, then the glass is going to look kind of cloudy rather than clear. And so there's a fine line in terms of how you do that. Now, once I've done all this, there's one last thing that I want to do in my transparency channel. And that one last thing is what's called absorption color. And absorption color is, I don't know if you've ever seen glass that has like a slightly green tint. I'm looking at a jar right now that has just a slight touch of green in the glass, and that's a very common color for glass to have. You can also tint it so it's like brown like a beer bottle, or green like a Heineken bottle, or right, something like that, or blue like some tinted blue glass. But if you want it to look right, it looks really flat right now. And so if I go to my absorption color and I set it to somewhere, like I've found that somewhere around like 113, and somewhere in the 40s in terms of saturation, is pretty good. And if I hit OK, then you'll see that this preview turns a little bit green. And if I render this, already like I get just a tiny, tiny touch of green in here that makes this feel a bit more like a real glass. Now, the absorption distance is a key value here. Absorption distance is basically how much glass does light move through before it becomes 100% green and essentially look almost black. Okay? And right now it'd take 100 centimeters of glass before you get that effect. If I reduce this significantly, like let's say I set this down to 1 centimeter, you'll see that this is much greener. And if I render this now, the entire glass has a much more green tint. And you can see the areas where it's about an inch thick, and areas where it's significantly thinner, like up here, right? But I get this nice gradient between the thick and the thin sections of this glass. Now, that's a little bit too much, right? So let's go ahead and try 5 centimeters and render it again. Right? And so now this is, I'd say still this is a little bit too green, but I'm getting something more subtle. And so if I go ahead and do, say, 10 centimeters, right, then when I render this, this is almost more accurate. I could probably say, honestly, if I was trying to judge this based on the glass jar that I'm looking at, I bet 20 centimeters would be about where I want to be. And actually, having done 20 centimeters, I would actually say 15 centimeters is where I would want to be, right? So again, this is based on your reference object, right? And you can adjust this color as well. If I want it to be a bit more saturated, you can see what impact that has on the color of the glass. It's more subtle. The big thing that's going to make a difference is the absorption distance. And like even if I go way up in the saturation and render this again, I might get like a very subtle change here, but it's still going to be pretty minute compared to what else is happening. And you'll notice, right, my shadow is also green, right? There's that green tint exists in everything in there, which gives us a really nice look and feel. Okay, so if we're happy with this glass material, let's go ahead and apply it to our other object, which for some reason didn't work. There we go. And let's go ahead and render this. Oops, let's go ahead and render the correct window. Right, okay, so I've got my two glasses here. Now, in my view, I turned the wine off, but I want to go ahead and show you, here's in the object manager, the wine's over here. So I'm going to turn those on. And now if I render this, I've got something very, very dark inside this glass, right? And before we go further, what we need to do is I want to show you what this looks like so that if you're modeling a fluid inside another object that's going to be transparent, how to make that look accurate. And so I'm going to close the material editor for a moment, and I'm going to turn off the wine glass that has no wine in it, which is this bottom one. And then I'm going to go to the right view. I'm going to make that huge. I'm going to select my wine glass to start with. I'm going to hit S on the keyboard, I think. S on the keyboard, there we go, with my mouse hovering over the viewport. Right, so this is the wine glass, and you can kind of see an edge here where the wine is. All right, and so I'm going to go ahead and turn off the visibility of the lathes of both of these objects. And you'll see that everything's disappeared, which means that actually the view I want to be in is the front view. And I'm going to hit the letter S on the keyboard, oops, again, but I'm actually going to select this. Sorry, I'm going to turn the wine glass on, hit S. There we go. Now it's framed appropriately. Turn that off, and then select this spline here for the wine itself. And when I zoom in, I want to show you a few things you need to be conscious of. So first, you'll notice that the wine is actually penetrating the glass. In order for Cinema4D to accurately map that transition between these two things, there needs to be some intersection. If you don't have any intersection, if there's a little tiny air gap in here, then you basically get, it's like an air bubble, right? So you get the light refracts as it hits the glass, it refracts as it leaves the glass, enters that air pocket, and then refracts again. And you get some really strange effects in there, and you're not quite sure what that is. So you want to make sure that that these edges intersect. They don't necessarily need to intersect as much as it is in this model. The less, the better, but you want to make sure that there's no gaps. The other thing is, all of these points in both of these splines that are on the y-axis, when you're using a lathe, they need to be at 0 in the, in this case, it'd be along the x-axis, but if you were modeling it the other way, it'd be along the z-axis, right? Whichever view, if you're in the right or left view, it'd be 0 in the z, and in the front view, it'd be 0 in the x, right? Because if they're offset at all, they overlap, and we talked about this before. But the artifacts become very, very apparent in transparent materials. Okay, so that's some of the setup if you're doing this is that you want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and turn everything back on, and I'm going to go back to my perspective view. And I'm intentionally leaving the perspective view small so that it renders more quickly while we're working on this, rather than having to wait for that whole window to render. Okay, so we've got everything we need to make. Now we need to make some wine, right? And so we've already made this glass material we're pretty happy with. So if I hover over it, hold down Control, click and drag, and release over here, I can create a copy of that glass. And I can double click on it, and now I just need to make a couple changes. So first, I need to change the name to wine.1. So I already made other wine. Obviously, the absorption color is not accurate, so I'm going to go ahead and, unless you're drinking some really crazy wine, I'm going to go ahead and change this. And trying to find a color that does the right thing in the absorption color is a little tricky, but I know that it's a pretty red, I mean, magenta seems crazy, but it's a pretty red color. And so I'm going to go ahead and start with 320, 80, and 62. Just to see where that gets me. It looks already, I can tell it's probably going to be a little dark. I'm going to leave it set to 15 centimeters now, but I know I'm probably going to want to reduce that. And then there's one other thing that needs to happen, and it needs to happen anywhere that I have this refraction set. Wine is basically the same as water, right? Water's refraction is 1.33, right? And wine is 1.337, which I just found out recently, a particular type of wine, right? So it's a little bit off, but where I have the refraction here, I also need to go to the Fresnel and make that change here. And I can just say 1.337, right? And it'll say it's custom. And then I can go back to transparency. And reflectance doesn't worry about the Fresnel here at all. And so now if I go ahead and apply this material to the wine. So I'm going to close the material editor for a second. I'm going to grab this. I'm going to drop this on the wine. And I'm going to go ahead and render. Oops, and not render that view. I'm going to render this view. Okay, so already I can tell that this is the most washed out wine I've ever seen. But it's allowing us to see the way that these two things intersect, right? You know, if you look at water or something in a cup, you don't see a seam between the cup and the water usually. It becomes this uniform magnifying glass, right? There's not real, that seam disappears except above the surface of the water, right? So let's go ahead and open up our wine material again and say, all right, so first our absorption distance is way too big. I'm going to set that to 1 centimeter, and I'm just going to go ahead and render this and see what happens. All right, so 1 centimeter is probably a little bit too dense. You can kind of see down here, and if I zoom in a little bit, rotate my view a touch, and I'm trying to make sure that I can see both the shadow and the wine glass. But yeah, so you can see down here where it's coming through a little bit, but it's pretty dense up there, right? Because that's several centimeters thick at the top. And so maybe 2 centimeters is better. We'll go ahead and render that again. And it looks like that's a little too thin. That's more like a rosé if I change the color. So I'm going to go ahead and say maybe like, and I can go back and forth, but I know from experience, having just done this tutorial, about 1.2 centimeters for me seemed like a decent body in terms of the wine. Now the color, right, is a little bit off, I think. It seems like it's too purple. And so I'm actually going to bring this and make it more red. And I might pull this up a little bit and make it a little lighter in color, and then render that again. And so here I'm starting to get something that looks more like a red wine, right? I might want to boost that maybe even a touch more, just to see, how far I can push it before it starts to look strange. And so with the color, which is 330 degrees, 84%, and 78%, seems to be pretty accurate. And I might even go down and say, let's go to 1.1 centimeter, or maybe even 1 centimeter, right? Because this is light enough that I'm actually seeing through it. But when I go and I rotate my view a touch more so I can see that shadow, you can see that, right, this is actually a really nice wine-colored shadow that we've got on the backdrop here. And so this is a pretty good place to be at, right? We've got our wine glasses. We have our, everything else is set. You can actually see that the shadow of the wine glass is being refracted slightly through the wine glass here, right? So they're different sizes. That's one of the really great things about the physical render engine, is that it does a great job with transparent materials and making sure that what's happening behind them is physically accurate. Okay, so we've made some materials that allow us to create glass, allow us to create wine. Again, if you have any other material you want to make, if you follow these basic steps, you will have success doing it. All right, I'll see you at the next tutorial.